Good morning. Hi, everybody. I think we've waited long enough for people to start funneling in, so we'll get started. Welcome to NACCB 2022. It's very exciting to have you all here after a odd few years that we've had. The theme of the conference this year is restoring connections and building resilience, which is really appropriate for the last few years that we've had. And again, we're just really glad to have you here. So I hope you're already enjoying the conference and making connections. I'm Alicia Cipher. I am the chapters representative on the North American board. And I'll tell you a little bit about chapters in a second. But just some general info. For social media, we are using Instagram and Twitter. You can go to our website, sebnorthamerica.org, to sign up to find those links, or just Google us and find us that way. And then if you do share anything on social media associated with the conference, use the hashtag NACCB 2022. They tend to be popular during the conferences. And also, unlike past NACCBs and other conferences that maybe we've all been to, we are going to feed you extremely well this week. So, during the exhibitor happy hour this evening, there is going to be a fajita bar, so don't go eat dinner. And then each morning, during the morning break till 10:30, there will be food, and there will be afternoon food during the afternoon break, like some snacks. So enjoy Reno, but you can eat here. And then, just to do my plug for chapters, we have a number of events this week that are solely for chapters. And for those of you that may be new to the society, chapters are a really unique part of the Society for Conservation Biology that a lot of other organizations don't have. And so what a chapter is, it's a local group. So while we have these big parts of SCB, like the global and the sections, you in your town, at your school, can have a local group. That is, you use the SCB logo and you make the chapter what you want. You can do outreach events, you can do conservation, you can do research, you can do policy, and you have SCB's name behind you. And we have a lot of great chapters in North America right now, and so we're trying to bring them back to the fold after a few weird years of little communication. Yeah. That's our plug on chapters, and enjoy the conference. I will turn it over to Rebecca McCaffrey, our president.
Thanks, Alicia. It was great, and yeah, please do, if you're curious about chapters, please do join these events. They'll be really a great way, and we're really looking forward, as I've mentioned a little bit about the transition and kind of moving our chapter or our section out of this time. We're really looking forward to reinvigorating the grassroots part of our organization, which is our local chapters. So today I'm just here very briefly to introduce the moderator for this morning's session. And so our moderator today is Amanda Stanley. Amanda is the executive director of Compass. Compass is a nonprofit which prepares diverse science leaders to become agents of change. Compass creates inclusive, safe, and empowering spaces for learning and transformation and provides ongoing support as scientists engaged outside of the lab and field. This means that they put on wonderful workshops at all levels of communication. I've taken a couple of them myself. That's where you learn about the message box and everything that comes out of there. And so Compass has been involved with NACCBs and with SCB for a long time, and we're really thrilled to have them organizing and running this plenary session today. So this morning, we have a panel that's going to explore a key question. As we seek to restore connections and build resilience in nature, how might we also build and restore our own resilience? And so now I'll turn things over to Amanda for this morning's plenary.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca, so much for that very kind introduction. So I'm Amanda Stanley, pronouns she, her. It is fabulous and a little strange to be here. This is my very first conference since February 2020. And it is wonderful to see all of you and have the chance to interact as three-dimensional human beings. I also want to welcome all of you joining us online, and I will confess I'm a little envious of your ability to conference in your pajamas and slippers. So this morning, I'm going to kick us off with a little framing about this plenary. Why this, why now, why us? And I'll introduce our panel. I'll get the conversation started with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, both in person and online. Before we get started today, for those of you like me who are just arriving and missed yesterday's opening plenary, I'd like to begin with a recognition of place and whose land we are on. So yesterday we were joined by Herman Fillmore of the Washoe tribe, and I've heard just wonderful things about the land acknowledgement that he gave here and centering us in place. And I want to refer to the challenge that he offered all of us attending this conference. He challenged us to four things: to learn more about the Indigenous peoples whose homelands we gather in. And you can go to the Washoe Tribe website. They have a really fabulous story of their history and their culture. Think critically about what we can do to support tribes and Indigenous peoples locally and globally, and reach out to them and get involved in issues that are important to tribes and Indigenous peoples. And lastly, he asked that we all respect the land in which we live and travel as much as the people who cared for these lands since time immemorial do. And I'd like to share a quote from Brian Wallace, who is the former chairman of the Washoe tribe. He said, "The health of the land and the health of the people are tied together, and what happens to the land also happens to the people. When the land suffers, so too are the people." And this is at the heart of why we are here today. Everything that has happened in the past few years has shown a bright light, brighter than the lights that are shining on me right now, on how our fates are intertwined and inseparable from the land. And as we work to restore connections and build resilience in a very changed world, we recognize that building resilience starts with us. I just flew on an airplane yesterday and got the reminder that you should put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. So what is resilience? It's a pretty overused and sometimes somewhat exploited word these days, but we're all probably pretty familiar with the concept of ecological resilience, which really just simply refers to the ability of a system to return to its current state in the face of disturbance. And it doesn't presuppose anything about whether that system is in a desired state. So you can have a degraded system that is highly resilient, and it's inclined to stay that way even when you try to restore it. And then there is the psychological idea of resilience, which is about this notion that people can remain or recover to a desired state of being in the face of pressure or hardship. And humans aren't so different from nature, surprise, surprise, in that once we are in a damaged state, we can tend to revert back to it, even when attempting to restore ourselves. And sometimes we can face pressures and changes that are so large that returning to a previous state really isn't workable, and we have to move forward into something different. At Compass, we talk to hundreds and hundreds of scientists through our programs, and what we hear over and over is the strain people are under right now. There's this immense urgency and drive to want to make the world a better place. Everything is feeling ever more urgent, but we are wrestling with so many things in our personal lives as well, especially over these past few years. We hear a desire for a different way of being, and we hear that people are ready to start on that path. And that is why we felt it was really important to have this conversation here today. So without further ado, let me introduce our really fantastic panel. I'll keep my introductions brief. You can see their full bios on the conference website. So starting with our folks joining us online, James Rattlingleaf is a global Indigenous consultant and principal of the Walakota Lab. And James works to support Indigenous peoples' nation rebuilding efforts through effective and respective application of traditional ecological knowledge in Western science. Over his long career, he's worked with an amazing variety of people and institutions, including Compass. I was lucky enough to work with him on a recent workshop on developing ethical space for building understanding and partnership between Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And James is just fantastic in that he sees this greater vision of human knowledge that incorporates the many insights of human cultures. Janaki Bhattacharya is an ethnoecologist who does applied research and biocultural conservation, specializing in wildlife and habitat stewardship and landscape level planning. And I've known Janaki since 2015 when she was a Wilberforce Fellow for Conservation Science. And Janaki works primarily for community-based and Indigenous-led initiatives, including being part of the core team who've been working to establish the Dasiquo protected area. This is the protected area for the Chilcotin people since 2012. And joining us in the room on stage, I first met Jose Gonzalez, I think a decade ago, on a walk along a woodland trail with a group of funders and others having a discussion about what it meant to be in nature, who got to enjoy it, how to open up access, and create equity in the outdoors. And our paths have crossed in the years since, as Jose is endlessly creative and involved in everything, I think, yeah. Jose is the founder and director emeritus of Latino Outdoors. It is Latino Conservation Week, so if you are celebrating that, there's lots of great activities that are happening this week. Check it out online. He's also a professional educator, illustrator, and science communicator. And I have been working with my colleague Karen McLeod in one way or another for more than 10 years. And Karen has nearly 20 years at Compass. And as such, she is the backbone of our organization. And she's done nearly every job that there is to do at Compass. Currently, Karen is the Director of Leadership Programs for Compass and is also a certified professional coach. And across all of these roles, she supports mission-driven professionals within science and beyond to have impact and thrive. All right, welcome everybody. So let's get this conversation going. So I'll kick us off with this. So we're here to talk about this idea that building resilience starts with us. And this is a lesson that we all have to learn, sometimes the hard way, at some point in our lives. So how did you come to realize that to continue doing the work of connecting people and nature, you needed to invest in yourself? So I'd like to turn things over and welcome in our folks who are joining us virtually. So James, I'm wondering if you can kick us off.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and welcome to the panel. I want to thank the organizers for bringing me in this way, and I apologize I want with you in person. But I want to begin by welcoming you in the Lakota language and say, "How midakiapi, chante washte nape juzapalo, James Rallingleaf, imachapi na shuchanga Lakota oyate, iuhan chante nape juzapalo." I greet you all today from my heart with a handshake. I am known as James Rallingleaf. I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and I'm real happy to be part of this panel when we talk about resilience and certainly bring my perspective into this conversation. I think we are at an important point in time in our world and in our cultures. Certainly for the Lakota people, we find ourselves at this crossroads again. Where do we go from here? What do we have learned from the past in terms of supporting our people, supporting our lands, and supporting all aspects of nation building? As was stated in my bio, these are big topics. These are big questions that we wrestle with every day. But I'm here to say also that through this kind of work that we're involved in, I'm really glad that the Compass organization has taken the step forward to bring us together for this conversation, to talk about how do we not only deal with the certain aspects of our leadership, but also how do we recharge? How do we take care of ourselves in this time? And certainly these last 2 years for myself, it's been real difficult in a way because in our culture, we really stress relationships to one another, relationships to our community, relationships to our land, and all aspects of things that are important to us. And so despite those many challenges, we find ourselves today in a really important time. As was mentioned, I work with traditional ecological knowledge, and we find more and more that this aspect of our understanding of the world is becoming more important in terms of raising the importance of it from our own government to academia, to our communities, and to ourselves. So we find ourselves today again in this important time. And I think the conversation today really is going to, as I see it, is going to focus on our leadership and really begin to identify how we build resilience within ourselves. For me, as a cultural person, as an Indigenous person, we look to our cultural protocols, we look to our cultural customs, and we look at how we view ourselves within the world. And now that we live in a time now where our technologies have allowed us to communicate like we are doing today, gives us more and more opportunities really to stay in touch, but also what can we do using these platforms today. So I come from it from a shared vision. I come from it from really community-based participatory kind of processes, but also really how do we prepare ourselves? How do we get ready for this work? So it's a combination of those things, I think, that allow me to be here with you today to address you in this way, and to really, again, looking forward to our time together today. And I'll stop there for my opening remarks. So thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Karen.
Good morning, everyone. So my resilience journey has been a combination of both a gradual awareness of the ways in which my historical tendencies have not been serving me or Compass or my family, and also a big health scare that really was a watershed moment for me. So in January of 2018, the universe taught me a massive lesson in listening to what was happening in my body. A few days into the new year, I had a sudden onset of the most excruciating headache you can possibly imagine. If I sat up or stood up, it got much worse. So I had sprung a spontaneous leak in my spine, but I wouldn't know that for some time. This leak would go undiagnosed and untreated for many months, while we eliminated brain tumors and other scary possibilities. And I thought many times that this would be the end of my life. So during this time, I lived flat on my back, unable to think, unable to move, unable to parent or work or move through the world in any of the ways that I used to. And while I have no idea what caused that leak, it's not hard to imagine that I was pushing myself to the breaking point as I did that regularly. And to be clear, I'm not throwing Compass under the bus here. My stress is largely self-imposed. So this was a really massive wake-up call for me. And on this side of it all, I realized that the gifts from this painful experience for me were about the strength of my heart, as that's really all I had available to me at that time. What it means to be open to and in touch with my own pain and suffering, and how that can help open me to the suffering of others and to the world. And I was reminded over and over again of the power of community and the power of support. There's no way I could have gotten through this experience without the support of colleagues and neighbors and friends and relatives near and far. And being a mother has also really strongly influenced my journey of resilience. My daughters are 13 and 16, and for their sakes and mine, I can't parent if I'm not also showing up for myself. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. And in Jose's words, I think this is really about healing severed connections. For some of us, those are severed connections with our whole selves. For some of us, those are severed connections with each other. And for many of us, those are severed connections with the world. So I'm really excited about how we think through all those different threads of healing. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Karen. Janaki, can we hear from you?
Sure. It's been an ongoing process for me, working out that it's important to care for oneself. When I was a kid, I struggled with a lot of health problems. And so I learned from an early age that I had limits and that I couldn't I'm inclined, I'm competitive, I'm inclined to push myself in pursuit of whatever goal I decide is important, and very early had to learn the lesson that there were limits to that. But when I was younger, I thought of that as a failing. I had to accept it, but I thought of it as a failing. Right through, university. I just thought, sometimes I just had to say no to things because I couldn't do it. But I didn't see that as a strength. I saw it as a weakness. And as I matured, as I grew into, early career stages, I looked around and also noticed a lot of mentors, a lot of people I really looked up to in the conservation movement, struggling with health problems, struggling with burnout, struggling with bitterness and disillusionment. And that certainly was thought-provoking as well. I remember really thinking, oh gosh, I need to think about what kind of person I want to be in this world, not just the outcome of the work that I'm trying to do. And I would say at this stage, it's never an end point, right? We're all trying to figure stuff out, and who knows what lesson is around the next corner. But at this stage, through the communities I work with, through the work that I've been doing, and through some pretty intense, setbacks, personal losses as well, now I've come to realize, looking after, nourishing myself as part of the system that I am trying to help. I don't see it, that old approach that I used to believe in as sort of self-sacrifice as a noble thing for the cause is not where that's not even the framing I have anymore. I think about myself as part of the system that I'm working for, part of the ecosystem, part of the community, part of the family, whatever they're not just metaphors, they are literally true. And if the goal is well-being, if the goal is to strengthen all of those things, then, as Karen said, as James said, I can't do that if I am not well. I will become, there's a give and take. There's a breathing, right, with the people and then the natural systems that we are part of. Sometimes we're taking, sometimes we're able to give. But if I don't look after myself, I will become a constant drain. I won't be able to enter any of the relationships with the communities or with the ecosystems that I am working to support. And I won't be able to contribute to those. I will enter those relationships in need. And so what I'm working on now, what I'm trying to, that realization, that way of conceiving of it has come, but it takes a long time to break some old habits. So I've come to realize that it's important to take care of myself as part of the conservation work that we're all doing collectively. The how is a little bit trickier.
Thank you so much, Janaki. All right, Jose.
Oh, thank you. Buenos días, everybody. Jose Gonzalez, or as I often say, full disclosure, Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales. He, him, his, though I'll respond to anything offered with joy and respect. I currently reside in ancestral, traditional, stolen, unceded, and occupied lands of the Nisenan, Maidu, Southern Miwok, out by Sacramento. And there's so much in my mind and in my head, I think, about how to approach this question, and there's so much that I want to both share and learn. And I want to start both in also honoring, I know, a lot of the vulnerability that the speakers are sharing and are offering, because I think that's an important connection about why you do this work in the first place. And we often say, why are you showing up to do the work that you do? And what's either going to facilitate that or impede that? And I say that because I can understand how at times you think of resilience, of taking care of yourself, and it seems maybe this outlier of an idea to the core of the work that you do, until you have to think about that if you're not well to do the work, then that is a very clear connection as to how and whether the work will do that. And I say this because in terms of my journey to this, so I'm an immigrant from Mexico, born in a relatively small rural town, state of Nayarit, migrated to the United States, to California at the age of 9 in the Central Valley. And to me, that was one of my first introductions to the idea of resilience from kind of an economic model, which is what does it mean to be resilient in the face of poverty? And not knowing actually that I was poor until I came to the United States. Because yes, maybe I was differently resourced in Mexico, but we had what we needed. And it was once I was able to see contrast in a particular way that I began to, I think, unpack a lot more. And so as I journeyed through the educational system, that was another introduction to the idea of resilience, which is what does it mean to be a positive statistic rather than a negative statistic? What does it mean to make it, right? What does it mean to do well in school in ways that, for whatever reason, could be surprising, right? Because anybody of a particular demographic like mine may not make it, and many of my friends did not. And once I got connected into the idea of nature, the outdoors, and my interest in environmental conservation work at large, I got connected to the of resilience of what does this look like in ecological systems. And for me, it's always fascinating because so many of us are familiar with these ideas, with these frames, but they're always over there in the work that we're doing and looking at rather than how they're also part of how we are part of that. So I said, I know you understand carrying capacity. Why does that all of a sudden become a foreign idea when it's for you, right? As if that doesn't apply to you in particular ways. And the kind of two last things are, as I began my own cultural identity work, and by which I mean is I wasn't Latino until I came to the U.S. So I am Mexicano by birth, I am a U.S. citizen through naturalization, I'm Latino through social cultural identity, I'm Chicano through social political identity, and Hispanic by census count. That was meant with a bit of humor. And so that then, as I reconnected to my own indigeneity and what that meant to be in relationship to other ways of knowing and being, especially with other communities and especially with ancestral knowledge, that idea of resilience then really allowed me to weave a lot and go from generally much more mechanistic models of being, and there's nothing wrong with those. It's just allowed me to see then how am I also weaving in ecological models and really more of a life logic into how I approach things, which also brought in a lot of fun, a lot of creativity. And that's part of why I like to play with words and rely on poetry and illustration to weave all of these. And so I want to close because with this idea of resilience, every now and then, I like to look at the root of words, like the etymology, and like something like resilience, which I was looking at, and says, comes from the Latin resiliere, which is to jump back or to recoil, or salir. I can't speak Latin very well, but it's like saltar in Spanish, which is to jump back. But it has that, still to me, that kind of cyclical element. And so I say this because I want to close with this idea that a lot of the work that I want to approach is how to be radical and revolutionary. And that when you hear those words, if you're thinking, oh, that's like out there, this is extreme, this is an outlier. And to be radical, the root of the word is root. So I think it's like, what is actually grounding us in the root of the work? So I'm being radical by being much more here than thinking it's out there. And so I think of resilience as radical work. As I've always said, healing severed connections, which means it's here. How am I supporting process of healing? Which gets to the last one, which is revolutionary, which has the root of those words is around revolutions, around cycles. And so I ask, how am I supporting regenerative cycles, which, no surprise, they're found throughout nature. It's part of the design work. And it's when we harm, when we disrupt those healing cycles that we tend to get in the trouble that we do. climate change as breaking of the carbon cycle is one of the biggest ones, but also within our own bodies. Because I know that, unless in very few cases, or unless you're creating brand new organs from stem cells, a lot of the ways that even simply to approach healing ourselves is to not get in the way of our bodies what they're programmed to do that. If I get a cut and I go to the doctor, what they're trying to do is just close it up, right? Stop the bleeding so that the body can do the healing. Unless they're gonna Star Trek me with some quick heal, I'm like, we're not there yet. But it's those little reminders to me that often says, how am I supporting resilience by being radical and revolutionary, and how I'm facilitating regenerative cycles rather than perpetuating harmful ones or breaking good ones. So I want to pause there, and feel free to tweet anything that I say. José Bilingüe.
All right. So this was a great start, and there is so much wisdom gathered here today. It is fantastic. And I think for a lot of us, we recognize some need for change in our lives. The way that things aren't working for us right now. And how do we find that path to a better place? How do we support those regenerative cycles? How do we get past the challenges of breaking those bad habits for good? So my next question for our panelists is, how do we get started? What does resilience in practice look like for you? And I'll open this up to whoever wants to chime in first.
I always hesitate, so.
All right. Okay. Let's see, Karen, I know you always have some thoughts on this.
Sure. I wasn't sure if Janaki was trying to speak, though.
Yeah.
No.
All right. We'll do
All right.
Karen, and then Janaki can jump in.
All right. I'm happy to start. So for me, resilience in practice means several different things. One is really paying attention to my energy. So what nourishes me and what depletes me, and how do I think about the course of my day through that lens? One thing I learned from a wonderful mentor a few years ago was about this idea of energy sandwiches. So if we're anticipating something that's going to be really depleting coming up in our day, how might we surround that with things that give us energy? So it could be something like dancing. I like to dance, so do a 5-minute dance before I'm going to do something that feels really depleting. And back to this idea, I think it often is going to come back to how do we actually root ourselves in the now, in our experience. And I love that sense of that's what radical actually means. Another practice for me is about literally grounding myself in this moment by lying on the ground for a few minutes. So I most recently did this on a huge slab of granite at Pear Lake in the Sierras, and it was so magical.
Yes, I agree.
So anything, you can also do this in your room on the 23rd floor of the Silver Legacy. It feels a little bit different and a little harder to access the ground, but if you can imagine yourself in a different space. I've been struck by the fact that the casino is essentially a tribute to not being here. Another piece for me is about exercise and being in my body and taking care of my body. So trail running is a very important resilience practice for me. Stillness, I do practice daily meditation. And for me, it's not about achieving a particular length of time, it's about doing it. So just committing to spending some time being with myself every day. Doing something fun. So one of my favorite resilience practices is skipping or hula hooping or playing hoops with my kids, or something that actually brings some semblance of joy and possibility into my life. And the most important thing that I want to say about resilience practices that I've learned from many people that I've worked with and my own life is about the power of small. So for many of us, it must mean we need to train for a marathon, or we have to take a month off or 6 months off. And it's not to say that sometimes we might get to a point where that kind of intense recovery is important. But I think it's also about what is something that you can do a few times a day, for a few minutes a day. How might that help you tap into being more present in the now and in your experience of your life as it is? How might you pause and take 3 breaths 3 times a day? And I think there's a lot of power in, and we're learning a lot about neuroplasticity and the ways we can rewire our nervous systems through the power of those kinds of really small practices. So that's good for now.
Awesome. Thank you. Janaki, were you hoping to jump in there?
Sure. That was such a great pragmatic list that, I wanted to start with what she said, especially, all of the little things and the tracking what nourishes oneself and what drains you and what gives you energy. For me, that's been really important to learn. I kind of feel like the what does it look like in practice question it crosses scales, right? So it's hard to list everything because there's what we do on a daily basis. There's what we need in a given year, and there's how we're moving through our lives. And so, yeah, for me, the more daily things are absolutely being physically active, connecting, with loved ones and with nature, resting enough, all of those things. I think that at a bit of a larger scale, since Karen spoke so well to all those things, I'll go with, part of it for me has also been realizing that the emotions I feel do have a role in this work. In fact, they can be part of the source of strength that drives this work. And so I work for places because I love them. I work for communities because I feel love for them. And that means that, as I often said, I work at the ragged edge of heartbreak. And a lot of us do. Probably everyone in the room and everyone online does, because that's what pulls us into this line of work. And so there can be grief when there are losses. There can be joy when you have those moments of connection. And a big part of what resilience looks like in practice for me these days is trying not to beat myself up about how I'm feeling about the work that I'm doing. So there's for that I rely on friends. I literally, having someone I can debrief with at the end of the day, or that person, that colleague that, you send a text to when you've just said no to something and set a boundary, and you need the support for, I just said no to a thing. These are the support network in community that allows me to be a whole human being in the work that I do has been really important. So those ties, those people that I can reach out to, the practice of setting boundaries, of sometimes learning to say no to things. And like I said, I've realized that a huge part of what tires me out or what burns me out, yes, there's the circumstances that I'm working in, and I can try to tweak and adjust my workload, the people that I'm contracting to, things like that. But when it comes down to it, in conservation work, we are dealing with deep loss, and it's okay to be sad about that. And so a big part of what I've been learning in practice from friends, from loved ones, they have to tell me, is not to be apologetic, not to beat myself up about how I feel when the work exhausts me or frustrates me or tires me. Just to feel seen and supported, and to make sure that I'm really investing energy in those relationships. That's part of what resilience in practice looks like for me at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
Happy to go next.
Yeah, Jose.
I will provide a frame and some ABCs, because I think there's so much to this question as well. And we wanted to recognize that, we still want to know, okay, what could I do, right? And so for me, 2 things around a frame, mentioned radical, and radical with the CLE, as you know, is that first little root of the seed, is that how do you take that first plunge? especially when you're like nice in your little seed stage. And then all of a sudden you get a signal. It's like, hey, it might be good to like go. And it's there's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase. I think it's from Lab Girl. It's like you resort to all of your programming, and then the conditions are just right, and you literally take the plunge. But it doesn't mean it's careless, right? It comes with what you have been working on with certain aspects. Even as I often say, it's when you're in the dark. It's when it feels you're in the dark, and yet you have what's within you to still be rooted as a start there, but you're guided towards the light. And then similarly, that a lot of this work can just be very messy. Healing isn't always nicely romanticized, kind of like, and now I'm better. You go through stuff. Somebody reminded me, it's like being a butterfly, and all of a sudden you go from caterpillar or butterfly, and some of you know what that process is. It is just liquid gooification, right? It is just, you are redone from the inside. And yet, how do you know what still guides you, what stay in there? And it's those imaginal cells. And so I often say, imagine what is you at your core, so that even when you take these messy, transformative processes, you still have within you, right? It's what is this core of the state of who you are that can continue to be there even as you will grow and change, and not be perhaps the same person you were, which can be okay. And so sometimes I start with like some ABCs. A is the awareness. And there's so much can go in there, it's already been mentioned. It can be an awareness of like, I am in a space that's not designed for restoration right now. You can look up at attention restoration theory, for example. That's something that I love to really pay attention to. It's especially the work of the Kaplans, who were two of my mentors at the University of Michigan. But also just even awareness to be able to say things like, I am not doing well right now. And for some people that can be hard, because then you can realize saying that makes me feel weak. Where did that come from? What has told me, what has fed to me that it was not okay to say something like that? And again, just awareness, just being able to pay attention and notice in those ways. So definitely lots of practices there. B is kind of the boundaries. And by boundaries, I was getting at the whole sense of thinking about what boundaries means for your care. It doesn't mean completely isolating yourself or just removing yourself, but it can at least pay attention that you're saying, hey, I am a degraded habitat at this moment. That means my carrying capacity is not the same as if I was in my full enriched splendor. Right? And to get there, that boundary will grow and shift and expand. And sometimes it can be like, I realize I am at capacity right now, and I'm sorry, but I just don't have the capacity to be able to talk about structural oppression at this moment. But it does interest me. Let's check in tomorrow. Mm-hmm. It doesn't signal you don't care. It's just knowing that if I take more of that weight right now, it's not going to help the restoration process. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, for C is still a connection. It's a community. It's acknowledging that as you set boundaries, it's not creating a border wall, which, as you all know, isn't great for conservation outcomes. But you can look at boundaries just as, ecotone, an edge effect. Who am I in relationship with in connection, such that I know that it can be in a zone of abundance rather than a bifurcation, or I create a dead zone of separation. Mm-hmm. And that can be as simple as reading a favorite book of yours. Dr. Sapolsky, I think, he's a primate researcher at Stanford, loves to note how we humans have created such opportunities for stress for ourselves, because we've created so much time to do more beyond just the basic hunt, kind of go gather food and then just stay with survival. So we created opportunities to stress ourselves. Having said that, we also have a lot of opportunities to be resilient in ways that other primates don't. You could read your favorite comic book and identify with that character and feel better. You can listen to Beyonce and feel better. You could have a connection to somebody on the other side of the world in ways that can help make you feel better, that are not as easily accessible to some of our non-human kin. But I just want to put those in there as it's the little things, it's the mundane magic that I like to talk about it in relationship as well to some of the bigger structural pieces of not just self-care, but how are you practicing what I call community and structural care.
Excellent. James, anything you'd like to add to this question of what resilience in practice looks like for you?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. I've been watching this Netflix series called Alone, Grizzly Mountain.
Mhm.
And if you watch that, I've never seen anything like that before in my life. And you listen, if you believe what the participants are saying in their video messages to us about how they miss people. They're in one of the most beautiful places in the world. I think it's Chilicone Lake there in British Columbia. And to me, it's fascinating to hear the importance of family to these guys. They make it past the first few weeks and then they start missing people. And even though they're surrounded by nature and grizzly bears and all these things that we work so hard to protect and to conserve. So it got me thinking a lot about, again, where am I now in my own journey as a human being? And for me, it's been this whole idea of re-indigenization. And Lakota culture is a very prominent culture. It's known globally. We share a lot of our culture and customs and spirituality with the world, and we still do. And a lot of other tribal cultures don't do that, but we do. And I always wonder about that, but we do. And I also find myself today, as we talk about how do we take care of ourselves and resilience, I think it's again, it goes back to the relationships. I am a grandfather now, and so when you become a grandfather, I think it changes you. I think you begin to see that the next generation has come. Your next generation come, and so to me, it's about how do you prepare yourself, how do you prepare your grandchild, for the future, a different world than you grew up in. I think resilience for me is responsibility. To me, as a grandfather, the things that I know, things that I've learned, people I know. It becomes then responsibility to share that. Then I think about reciprocity. How many people have poured into your life today to get you here today in terms of their knowledge and their experience, their education, their spirituality, to be in a leadership role. So reciprocity reminds us again that we have to give back, and we have to give back in good and honorable and respectful ways. And my other thought would be is respect. I think when I see elders and knowledge holders, and I'm so glad that the local tribe there participated in this meeting. Again, it's a reminder as human beings that we need to respect one another, even when we don't agree. And we know that we live in a divided digital world and diverse world. Digital, divided, and diverse world today. And so to me, I see, my work going forward is continue to work in those areas, work in those spaces, and be reminded again that for me to be effective leader, my relationships matter. And I got to make sure I take care of those things. And also, I think for us also is that to be mindful again about that it's okay to have diversity in our way of living, a way of thinking in our languages. And so I share those things as to give me strength is to grow in knowledge of my culture, again, grow and share those things that are good, but also to listen and to learn and to lead. So I'll stop there with my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think there are so many threads there that resonate with all of us around starting small, finding the little things, finding joy, finding connection, finding community. I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists before opening up to questions from the audience. And so this is a good time, if you've been mulling on a question, to keep mulling on that. I'd like to remind you all of 3 things about questions. First, a question ends with a question mark. Important thing. Second, let's maximize the time from our panelists by keeping our questions as concise as we can. One thing to strive for is this a question that you can ask in one sentence, one breath. Lastly, there's all questions are welcome. There are no bad questions. If you're wondering about something, I can guarantee you somebody else is too. So please feel free after I ask this one last question, we'll opening things up to the audience. We've got some mics. You've got ways for the folks online to type your questions in, and those can get read out. So, and remember that today is an invitation to start a conversation that we hope will continue on. And so we may not get to all of the questions, and I think we could keep this discussion going for the entire conference, and I would find that wonderful and a source of resilience and joy myself. All right, so turning to my last question, all of you alluded to this in some way, shape, or form, the sense of connection and community, the grounding, the roots that we have. Many of us study communities, ecosystems, the complex interactions among people and nature. We know that none of us exist on our own, but sometimes, particularly with some of the isolation that's come from the pandemic, it can feel that way. What should our organizations and institutions be doing differently? This building resilience isn't just on our own as individuals. What do resilient systems look like that would make it easier for all of us to thrive? And again, I'll open it up. Okay, I know, Jose, this is Jose's question.
I just want to, no.
Yeah, let's try to.
Well, I want to try this because I know during our planning conversation, we were trying to be attentive and conscious, right, of what does it look like in practice. And part of that is because it's still about us not just knowing, but it's also doing. And so I share this because that's another kind of 1, 2, 3. I do like my threes as well. The knowing, doing, and changing. And so knowing is, as I mentioned, part of that awareness work. Is what do I need to know? What do I need to know so I can do better? And so that, if you're looking at your organizations, for example, is, what do we know or don't know? Do we know if there's concerns among our peers, our staff, about what's working or not working for them? And sometimes that's where you start. So obviously it's not just that, but there's so many more things you can do. The doing is, now you actually have to start doing the thing, the practice. Now do better. And that can look like to be able to say both what does the research tell us and what is going to be much more conducive to wellness and practices and thrivability for the sake of wellness, not just for more productive output. So that's part of where I often ask other questions, like, in service of what? Why do you need them to be better? So they can produce more? That may be one of those cycles that I'm asking you to be cautious about. But what I wanted to anchor it was around the changing, which is transformation work. And the reason for that is, I think about the times that I might set a fitness goal, and I might say, I'm going to check my nutrition or eat differently or whatever it might be. And I can know that a bag of cookies is not as good as an option to something else that I want to eat for a fitness goal. Nothing wrong with the cookies. They're delicious, they're tasty, and all that good stuff. I just know they're not in alignment with the goal. And if I have too many of them, then that's going to kick up an unhealthy cycle. Having said that, then I can go ahead and say, got it, I'm going to do my best to just eat less of these cookies. But if they're still sitting up there in the cupboard, if I didn't really look at what the design of where my knowing and doing is taking place, I can't, cannot be surprised, as Janaki said, that I didn't beat myself because at 2 a.m. I felt like a snack and I went and grabbed those cookies. It was in my more vulnerable state. Or if you look at your hot and cold empathy gap, right? Hot, cold states, that are like, well, of course, now I'm going to be in the hot state, really hungry, grab the cookies, and realize I just did what in my cold state I logically said I was not going to do. So looking at what is the culture, the systemic design, the element in which your action, your knowing and your doing takes place, so that it facilitates those quote-unquote healthy practices and knowing, rather that it impedes or gets in the way or prevents more of that growth to happen. And so that can look like not just having the policies, but how you're supporting each other with those policies, and what are the mechanisms that will support actual policies and practices and changes in behaviors rather than just an expectation that our logical selves are going to know better. Because I'll close by saying, as Janaki just was on point, our emotional state, our affective filters play a large role. And that's why I look at what's the reasonable person model rather than just the rational person model that's going to create the conditions in which, as the Kaplans always said, we create the environments that bring the best of ourselves, because we can also be really good about creating environments that bring the worst of ourselves. No offense to where we're being hosted.
James, I know that you've talked a lot about sort of what it looks like maybe to create systems where more of us can thrive. I wonder if you want to jump in.
Well, Jose, you're doing great. I just want to say I agree with Jose and just be quiet. But I think that again, I think we're at interesting times in my lifetime. So I'm 58 years old, and so I've seen some things here in my life here in America. Now that I work around the world now, I'm looking and observing, what are those opportunities really to advance an agenda that is more respectful to Indigenous people. So that's where I work in. And then I also look at this whole idea again about traditional knowledge and where those things are going. I've been a part of these recent research proposals here from different organizations around the country here this last few weeks. And it's really, again, looking at, how do we, again, transform organizations to be more respectful of Indigenous people and their knowledges. We don't separate them. And so I think increasingly, do our things like United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. I think organizations need to look at very closely, and I would say need to adopt. To me, that's a framework to start the conversation about organizations and how they want to work with Indigenous people. Recently, I saw again very strong policy statements from people in the Arctic North, advocating and standing their ground of how science and research should work with them. Very strong letter to the National Science Foundation. And now they came up with these operating principles and protocols of how to do that. Not about us without us. I think organizations got to look at again why that matters. I mean, they have to dig deep and say, why should we include, for instance, Indigenous people in our knowledges that we bring with us? What are things that's going to look like where like diversity and inclusion and equity and justice, what does that look like? But I know that we can't do that. They can't do that themselves. So it's really incumbent on organizations like Compass and those that are in the audience today to look and get ready. I would say a practical step is to get ready. How do you get ready to engage? I think you have to do your self-assessments. You have to really understand why you're doing this. What's your motivation for changing, for transforming? And that could mean different things for different people. But I think the work is there. The opportunities are there. And I really do think Indigenous people are ready for this kind of things. I mean, we've seen the work that Janaki does in the North. I mean, Indigenous protected conservation areas, very powerful statement, very powerful vision. I really like, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And finally, I would say is organizations, let's take a look at the youth. Let's take a look at the youth and what role do they play going forward? How do you prepare your organization to work with Indigenous youth? And I think those are tremendous opportunities, and I think we got to do that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Janaki, do you want to follow on? Yeah.
Sorry, unmute. Yeah, thank you. I just really was really wrapped with attention with everything that Jose and James said, because I just couldn't agree more. And I think you put it so well. Thinking about organizations, I mean, there's so many directions that conversation could go in. Some of the things that spring to mind for me are, I sort of was thinking through, and I've got 4 thoughts that came in this moment. One is, break the silos. we have a tendency, whether it's whatever sector we work in, to have these old conventional beliefs about what's relevant to the workplace or the organization's mandate and what's not. I would say question that, right? So in our pre-call, part of what we were talking about was that idea of if you're a natural scientist doing conservation work and you start talking about some of the aspects around, the psychology of interpersonal resilience and things, you kind of get shunted down the hall to the social science department, or told that that's not really what we're here to do today. Let's break those silos and recognize it all matters. And that plays into what James is saying too. Like, organizations can support, staff, students, whoever, to do the professional development, to learn the history and context within which their work is happening, so that they can bring that to the work. It can mean support for, I would say the second thing is support people management and relational training. I've been in so many agencies and companies where it's almost expected that you'll get first aid and project management training. but honestly, if I think about what has helped me not only be more resilient, but support the communities and the coworkers and the students I work with in their resilience, I would say a lot of it came out of like relationship counseling. Glad something good came out of that. But it's communication skills that Compass teaches. It's the interpersonal skills that allows us to be there for each other. So I think organizations can put a lot more resources into an emphasis onto that. Tolerance for diversity and people's different strengths and approaches in conservation, I think, is really key to resilience, because none of us can tackle these massive, wicked problems alone. And so I kind of think that, we need to just embrace each other. People come at it differently. People bring different strengths. So one person may be a fantastic advocate, another does want to be behind the scenes, not talking publicly and just doing research. Fair enough. Work with what brings your strength into the work. And the fourth thing, from an organizational perspective, and I'll say this as someone who has experience with burning out, is friggin' don't overload your people. like if somebody, if staff, if students, if colleagues, leaders are coming forward and saying, I am at a breaking point, or I'm having trouble coping, respond with sympathy and action, not just the sympathy. Those are the things that spring to mind for me right now.
That is brilliant, as always. Karen, is there anything you want to jump in and add real quick before we?
No, for the sake of time, I'm just incredibly grateful of all of the wisdom of my colleagues.
All right, so we can open it up to some audience questions, whether you're in person, online. If you're in person, we've got some mics in the aisles there. I think there's also some roving mics about. Ooh, wow. All right, we got our first question. Jump on in.
Hi, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your viewpoints and experience. So often we define resilience as the endurance or the withstanding of disturbance. Yet there are many systems that require periodic disturbance for resilience. So my question is, how does positive disturbance factor into your concept of resiliency?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Karen, do you want to jump in since you
I actually brought a poem that I am going to use to answer this question.
Awesome.
Lovely.
You.
This poem is called After the Fire by James Cruz. Let me endure whatever fires must pass through here, must scorch my skin. And if I have to feel the heat, let me also trust that, like the lodgepole pine, the fire will open the parts of me that are still closed tight, releasing seeds I've been clinging to, hoarding for years. Let me thrive in this new clearing made at the center of my life, seeing now how necessary the flames melted away my resistance, revealing all that once lay hidden, asleep inside me. So I guess I would just offer, in addition to that poem, that I don't think this is all this journey to bliss. It really is about how do we be more present to our experience of the now. And as Janaki spoke to earlier and might continue to speak to, it's also a journey about being with our grief. And the more that we actually acknowledge and are able to be with our grief, the more we're actually opening ourselves to joy and to a much bigger range of possibilities. So I think there's an awful lot of goo in our resilience journeys, as Jose was alluding to.
Could I add real quickly?
Sure.
I'll be super quick because I think for me, fire is another really clear, concrete example. And so what I want to quickly add is, because fire is very real and visceral, especially in this part of the country. And it's, as a colleague also from Stanford, who often says, like, here we are dealing with our past practices catching up to us, compounded by climate change in terms of very intensive, destructive wildfires, while acknowledging that some are fire-adapted ecosystems that need some of this burning. And so to James' point about, like, what does this mean about reconnecting, right, to traditional and ancestral knowledge in the sense of, like, prescribed burns. But it isn't just a prescribed burn, it also means what does it mean to be a responsible fire tender? Because if we don't do that responsibly, then unfortunately we get things like in New Mexico. And so I'm saying this because then in the same way that we acknowledge that in ecological systems, sometimes for myself I might say, what prescribed burning may be needed in my relational spaces? What is underbrush that I've been neglecting? What is conflict and tension that I've been avoiding? As saying, well, let's not do anything. And then be shocked and surprised when, boom, it all catches up. And now we have to fire our way through it, knowing that that's not the sustainable option. So I just want to offer that in terms of I may ask myself that question, and that way I can re-honor a full range of fire rather than just the purely destructive one, and I can pay attention how that can be a sacred practice, not just a practical one.
Janaki or James, anything to add to that?
I think I just really love what they said, so I'm not sure that I'll add a lot, but just, yeah, to honor the question, I think it's hard, isn't it, to assign the values of positive and negative to the concept of disturbance. And so I would just say that in my, on a personal level, in my experience, you have the cocoon metaphor, the goo metaphor, the messiness that Jose and Karen talked about is very true. And so the disruptions, the disturbances in my life, I mean, they're not fun. They're not. They can be quite messy and hard. So if anything, how that plays into my own sense of resilience personally is that it has those setbacks, those knockbacks, the things that knock the wind out of you and, you know, send you to your knees. For me, those moments have forced me to think about why I'm really doing what I'm doing and whether I want to keep going. Because if you're going to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and keep going, and you've just lost what you thought was your purpose, then you have to do some, you have to really scrape together, you know, all right, if not that, then what? What am I here to do? How am I showing up? Why am I doing it? And that's resilience. It's painful and messy sometimes, and sometimes it's fun as hell, right? Like maybe there can be fun disturbance as well, like the unexpected things that you don't see coming that just like are like the experience of falling in love, like just bring it, that syrupy goodness into your life. That can be disturbing too. And it's also part of resilience.
That's wonderful. We've got goo, we've got syrupy goodness. James, anything you want to add before we go to the next question?
No, I think I don't. Thank you.
All right. Do we have another question coming up? Yeah.
Thank you all for this discussion. James and Janaki touched on preparing the next generation for resilience, and this hit home as a student who mentors other students. So what do you all think needs to be done to prepare the next generation for a focus on resilience practices?
Wonderful. James, I'm wondering if you want to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great question. Well, thank you for the question. I would say beginning, I'd say, we need our young people to be culturally intelligent. We need to prepare them to work with someone different than themselves. I think that as the world is changing, has changed, and will continue to change, we will find ourselves in spaces where we don't know, and we have to learn, and we have to figure out how we might mentor them, how we might coach them, and how we might support them. I'm gonna speak to the philanthropies right now. Those that are online or at the audience, philanthropy needs to have a special role in particular with supporting Indigenous youth efforts. Can I say that? I'll say that again. Philanthropy needs to support Indigenous youth-led initiatives. Just because the need is so great here. If I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and if you know socioeconomic issues and such, we're struggling up here. But yet we have some of the largest Indigenous populations here in the Dakotas and the Great Plains. And I think philanthropy again has a role to play. Somebody wrote this book called Decolonizing Philanthropy. I think that's all required reading for you all. Read that book and think about the history of philanthropy and how it came to be. And maybe from that reading, from that thinking and processing, we can come forward with some good ideas. I think also that, again, we are working on a workshop next month for bringing TEK into the classroom to the Ecological Society of America. Really, for the first time, again, this organization, as mainstream science organization, considering and opening a space maybe for Indigenous people and their knowledges. So again, that purpose again is to prepare young scientists to deal with Indigenous people and their knowledges. I think that's a important area. And I would say that in this time of a changing climate, in this time of, again, diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion, we need to work on these programs, but make sure that they're in co-development and co-management so that opportunity is for all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. Anything to add? No? Yeah? Okay.
I taught for a few years, and I was like the quote-unquote discipline and intervention teacher at a middle school. So I just want to echo what has been shared in terms of three quick things. One of them is how often it was important to keep joy going and alive. And for me, it's the idea of liberated joy, or I think as you mentioned, even play. And that's just good and necessary because so much of the work is heavy, especially in the systemic elements that many youth find themselves in. But also we often kind of say it's also good wellness practice. I'm sure maybe some of you have looked into the 20-second hug as an example. And part of that is just the adaptive evolutionary need that back in our quote-unquote prehistoric times, if we managed to get away from the predator, we got to go back to our close-knit community and be like, I'm alive, I feel good. Right? It's that release. But often we go through our worlds accumulating a lot of maybe not high predator type of dangers, but little ones. And then we ask ourselves, what was a release for me today or this week? Like that gazelle that escaped the lion and just kind of, you see them doing all of this as a way to like shake it out. Ask yourself how you do that. And so play for me for youth is critical because I wanted those to be practices for them. And sometimes they didn't get that. With my youth at lunchtime would close the doors to be like, all right, we're gonna just play. You don't have to tell anybody out there because I understand the face you got to put out there. But right now we're just gonna have fun. And the laughter was healing. And then lastly, the other element was, what does it mean to really, and it does take emotional labor, but keep that relationship between the wisdom of the elders and the creativity and the boundary pushing of the youth. Because neither really on their own gets us there, because as you get older and wiser, you might also become a little bit much more fixed in your worldview and not realize that the youth through even their adaptive inability to assess risk very differently, they might still push in ways that's like, actually, that's fantastic and innovative. We needed that. We need that kind of helpful stress on the system to make us more resilient to keep going, rather than become kind of hard and calcified in the ways that actually makes us pretty fragile.
Fantastic. Janaki or Karen, anything you want to jump in there?
I guess just one very quick thing I will add is I'm just aware of how many of us, students and beyond, are really hungry for spaces where they can just be real and authentic and feel seen and heard. So I think the more that we can do within, whether it's a graduate context or beyond, to create those kind of intentional networks of support and mentorship where people feel seen and heard and feel like it's safe to bring more of who they are into those spaces, the better off we will be.
Yes. So much so. All right, I think we might have time for one quick question. Yeah.
Okay, I might be able to make the question quick, but I don't know if the answer will be.
We'll do our best.
Okay, so both Jose and James's comments hint at another interpretation of the title of the plenary, Resilience Begins with Us, where you interpret us on a much larger scale. So thinking about poverty alleviation and the ways that conservation practices in the past have had not enough attention to humanity. And I was wondering, from the point of view of people who've worked really extensively in more community and outreach-focused contexts, what can conservation scientists do to help expand the interpretation of us to include taking care of humans?
Fantastic question.
I can go quickly since I was going to try to give you 3 tweetable things. And I share this with the planning committee. So one example is I was changing the frame, and I mentioned this at the beginning in terms of going from a reductive mechanistic logic as the default or dominant way of thinking thing to a life logic. And so here's one of the things I said, think about what happens when I say, wow, your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine. That may be familiar. You're like, yeah, we're being efficient, right? We're doing really good. And how does that change if I said, wow, your team is functioning like a thriving meadow? May sound odd, but then, how many of you would go to a meadow and be like, oh, do better, meadow? Like, you're not, it's being efficient in some way. It's being wonderful. But at least now it asks you to invite, well, so what are we valuing in terms of relationship with each other, of what leadership looks like, of what we're outputting, right? Of how we're being. And again, it's because it's pushing you, but again, it's not like people go out there and say, that's a beautiful monoculture of a forest. Diversity is important. So how are you thinking about that? When I mentioned habitat, so I said between the habitat of me and the habitat of you lies a zone of abundance and opportunity. And so when you think about those that ways, it maybe can take you in ways that maybe you haven't done yet.
Wonderful. All right, Janaki or James, anything you want to add to this question?
No, I'm just gonna. Well, if you want to hashtag something or tweet something, say hashtag James Rowlingleaf. How's that? No, I think. I think it's a great question. I love the question because I know some of the work that I'm getting involved in is with national parks. So this past summer, I was part of a tribal convocation in Lander, Wyoming, where the park superintendents of both Yellowstone National Park and Grand Tetons came together with tribal leadership to talk about the future of the parks and talk about the benefit. Well, how can we accrue and how can we expand and grow the benefits and opportunities for tribal nations and tribal people in not just in Wyoming but in the region. And so I'm really thankful for that, to see that, and also to begin the acknowledgement of what happened, how Native people were excluded and pushed out on those land bases, and then what do we need to do to reconcile that? So I do believe that under Secretary Holland's leadership and Interior and those kind of high level government leaders are going to talk about these issues more and more. And I really think that that's going to be part of what your answer to your question is really pushing. And those are hard issues. It's giving up power, it's giving up land. I mean, how many people do that, especially our federal government? So let's see what we can do. And plus, we're going to need people to support that. So stay tuned, keep involved, share these ideas among your community as well. So I'll stop there.
All right. We are coming right up on time. So I think we'll need to pause there on answers from our panelists. I want to do a few thank yous as we close. First, I would like to give a shout out to Megan Kevill, who is the organizer from SCB North America, who has made it possible for all of us to be here, for James and Jonaki to join us virtually, all of the tech people who've made this space available to us. Just so much gratitude. Thank you, thank you. And thank you to SCB North America for making space for this conversation. This feels like the conversation I wanted to have. So I'm very grateful that we got a space to organize this and bring this fabulous group of people together. I would like to extend a thank you to every single one of our panelists for bringing your joy, your wisdom, your vulnerability, your insights to these super important questions, and know that this really is an invitation to continue this conversation further. So we're happy to keep chatting. And the last thing I will say is, if you're interested in being more involved in helping build those supportive communities and networks, just to put a plug in for Compass, if you sign up and join our newsletter, we are going to be launching a network this fall to help our network of scientists and researchers connect and collaborate with one another, access ongoing learning opportunities, and really thinking about how do we create those spaces where we can be our best selves, where we can bring our full identities and have those spaces to be seen and heard that Karen was talking about. So feel free to connect with Compass and with all of our speakers. And with that, please join me in thanking all of our speakers.
Make some new signs. A sign that says currently in group process, or instead of staff at work, staff at play.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you, James and Jonaki. Bye.